Good afternoon, everybody. The keynote speaker for this afternoon is going to start around 4:30, so if everyone could slowly get to their seats. And like this morning, fill up this room here first, please. I don't think anybody, to be quite honest with you. I think that's left over from this. I'm not really sure, to be quite. In the room, start moving up toward the front, please. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody had some productive sessions this morning and this afternoon, and the conference is going well so far. This afternoon, I'd like to start off by introducing Don Ward again to come up to the stage. Don took up the role of Chief Executive of CIB back in March of 2020, and he's a highly experienced and globally recognized CEO for not-for-profit organizations in the construction and built environment sector. Please welcome Don Ward.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Hopefully that's the last time you'll hear that, Shabil. Thank you, Jim. As you know, the Congress is all about the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the contribution which our sector and which research in our sector can make towards progress towards those. For example, in submitting your papers for this conference, you were asked to indicate which Sustainable Development Goals your paper was feeding into. And Mike Beam did a great paper analysing all the papers from the 2022 Congress and the extent to which they aligned to the SDGs, if I recall correctly, Michael. And I'm looking forward to the one that analyses this year's framework as well. So, you know, the reason this framework works for us, the reason the SDG framework works for us is it allows us to communicate the value of research in the sector as pointing towards society's biggest challenges. How this sector and research in our sector can make such a major contribution to sustainable development. And the other reason is that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals takes us back to our roots in the formation by the UN Economic Council for Europe of the CIB as a network to bring together knowledge in our sector for the betterment of all. And incidentally, during Mark Hastak's presidency, we published that 70th anniversary brochure, recognising that, well, what are we now? 72 years on from our formation. And something Mark and I, as President Mark, has worked on is re-establishing strong links with the UN. For example, the Sustainable Built Environment Conference Series, which many of you will know, the World Sustainable Built Environment Conference is held every 3 years. Next year it'll be in Melbourne, I think it is, in June 2026, hosted by RMIT, led by Usha. That's a partnership with UNEP and also with FIDIC and ISB. We've pushed hard to make a meaningful contribution to the Global Alliance for Building and Construction, Global ABC, and Hub Kaisers and I attended, sorry, hi Hub, couldn't be closer. Hub Kaisers and I attended the annual meeting of that only, a couple of months ago, and Hub is leading a major work stream for them on passive cooling. Indeed, there's a workshop on that on Wednesday in a partnership with our Nature-Based Solutions Task Group. And we're talking to them about how CIB align as their research partner, in effect, in supporting all the policy work they do to advise the UN on its progress associated with COP. I'm getting there, but all of this is a long preamble as to why we've invited our next guest speaker. Mark Hastak and I visited the UN's New York office in October and met with Assistant Secretary General Ligia Noronha, head of the New York office of UNEP. We also had a call with the head of the UNEP North American office. So it is my great pleasure to invite that person to give a keynote speech. Rafael Peralta is head of the UNEP North American office. He's been director of the UNEP regional office for North America since July 2023. He was previously chief of staff at UNEP in Nairobi. I don't think he needs any more introduction. Please give a welcome to Rafael Peralta.
Hi, everyone. And first of all, thank you to Don. Thank you to CIB. Thank you to Purdue University for having us here. It is a pleasure. It's not every day that we come to an organization that is 20 years our senior. I just learned. We thought we were old because we're 52 now, but they were born 20 years before we did. And listen, let me start by telling you a little word about my own organization, about the UN Environment Program. Some of you may be familiar with it, others a little bit less. So who are we? We are the organization in the UN system that leads on the environment. So we support countries finding practical, science-based solutions that drive economic growth while protecting the natural environment. Now, for over 50 years, since 1972, we have been bringing governments, businesses, and civil society together to promote international cooperation, grounded in, as we describe it, common sense solutions and mutual interest. Now, as a science-based institution, we very much monitor the global environmental trends and ensure that decisions are based on the best available evidence. Now, one of our unique features is that we can help countries weave together environmental agreements or treaties. And as some of you may know, we're currently negotiating a global treaty to end plastic pollution, or at least that's the mandate that member states have given themselves to achieve through this treaty. Now, our current strategy is focused on supporting countries and stakeholders to address the triple planetary crisis, the crisis of climate change, the crisis of biodiversity loss, land degradation, desertification and drought, and the crisis of pollution and waste. Now, as part of our strategy, we obviously place a high priority on the building and construction sector. This is not only because of its large environmental footprint, but also because the sector offers us many valuable opportunities to accelerate the environmental dimension of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, before I focus more directly on what we have learned by working with the building sector, allow me one additional word on the Sustainable Development Goals themselves. One could assume that everybody is very familiar on what this beautiful wheel is all about. Now, the way we look at it is that it's nothing but a comprehensive framework for global action, aiming to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy health, justice, and prosperity. They represent a holistic approach to sustainable development, addressing interconnected social, economic, and environmental challenges. The SDGs are not just goals, but they're a call for collective action by governments, businesses, civil society, and individuals. Now, dear friends, we're all here today because we recognize that to achieve these Sustainable Development Goals, we need to provide a built environment that works for everyone. But it cannot come at the expense of further climate disruption. Every year, we publish what we call an emissions gap report, which basically documents the gap between what we need to reach the 1.5 or 2 degree targets and where we are in terms of emissions. And the last report that we published last year stated that we need to reduce 28% of emissions by 2030 to keep the 2 degrees alive, and a staggering 42% to keep 1.5 degrees alive. Clearly, urgent action is needed across all sectors, and without a doubt, decarbonizing the buildings and construction sector needs to be part of that solution. Now, if I can highlight from where we stand 3 realities that we absolutely need to keep in mind when we think of the building and construction sector, I would say, A, as you all know, the sector is a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions, with 31% of global CO2 emissions indeed linked to the building sector. Second, the sector is a major consumer of natural resources, and in fast-growing developing economies, construction materials are set to dominate resource consumption, with associated greenhouse gas emissions expected to double by 2060. And thirdly, climate change causes severe impacts on the built environment. This is true for heating and cooling, but it is also true for the performance, durability, and safety of buildings. Now, fortunately for us, the buildings and construction sector also offers many opportunities to achieve key energy efficiency goals. As the first global stocktake report presented at COP28 in Dubai by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, as everybody knows it, as this report indicated, the rapid and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions will require tripling of renewable energy capacity globally and doubling the global average annual rate of energy efficiency improvements by 2030. And according to our friends at the International Energy Agency, 40% of these energy efficiency improvements can be achieved through buildings. Now, the latest Buildings and Construction Global Status Report, which was issued by the alliance that was just mentioned by Don, by the Global Alliance on Buildings and Construction, highlighted that while change is underway, the pace of change is too slow. This latest report that we published earlier this year underscored a few critical facts. In 2023, for the first time, global floor surface growth was decoupled from greenhouse gas emissions, which have plateaued in the sector. Between 2015 and 2023, the sector's energy intensity declined by just 9.5, which is short, or is actually half of what is needed to keep the goals of the Paris Agreement alive. Number 3, renewable energy's share of final energy demand rose by 4.5, below the 17.8% goal needed to keep the Paris goals alive. And fourthly, financing the transition also remains a critical challenge. We know that global investment in buildings, energy efficiency fell by 7% in 2023 due to rising borrowing costs and the tapering of government programs in a number of regions. And also, we know that only 4% of global total investments in building construction was directed towards green and energy efficient projects. But of course, it is not all doom and gloom. The reality is that the buildings and construction sector plays a key role in our economy, in promoting prosperity and well-being, and it can therefore play a critical role in achieving the goals of the Sustainable Development Agenda. The longer we delay pursuing these opportunities, the longer we miss out on the numerous benefits that the buildings and construction sector has to offer. Now, it is true that inefficient and healthy buildings, and I've just heard some of your colleagues talking about that in one of the sessions, pose a risk to our human health and well-being every day, increasing thereby the vulnerabilities within our societies. But on the other hand, a well-designed and effectively implemented sustainable development sector supports at least 8 of the Sustainable Development Goals, from good health to affordable and clean energy to decent work and economic growth. Green building solutions do exist, and the sector also presents great opportunities for innovation to reduce energy demand, to decarbonize power supply, and to reduce the embodied carbon through material and efficiency strategies. So shifting to sustainable buildings and construction also offers a major prospect for businesses and jobs. The built environment accounts for 11 to 13% of global GDP and about 7% of global employment, as our friends at the International Labor Organization have reported. But also, buildings, or efficient buildings, are one of the biggest investment opportunities. They're worth an estimated $24.7 trillion by 2030 in emerging markets alone, as reported by the International Finance Corporation. And thirdly, for every $1 million invested in retrofits and efficiency measures in new construction, an estimated 9 to 30 jobs are created. By way of example, our partners at C40, an organization that works with cities around the world, estimate that Mexico City could see a 193% increase in construction jobs by adopting green building practices. So, urgent action is now required to decarbonize building materials and implement a whole life cycle approach to decarbonizing the buildings and construction sector. This would be good for the planet and people, but also represent a good business opportunity. Now, there are many elements to consider in making this transition just and effective, which I'm sure you will all be covering, and you're already covering in many of the sessions underway this week. So I will focus on the need for a life cycle approach to reduce embodied carbon from building materials. Emissions from producing construction materials currently represent more than a quarter of the sector's emissions, reliant on energy-intensive and mineral-based extractive processes. According to our projections, in fast-growing developing economies, these materials will dominate resource consumption. Together, this means that associated emissions may double by 2050, And this issue becomes even more urgent when you consider that half of the buildings that will exist by 2050 are yet to be built. So I want to emphasize 3 key shifts that we can make to avoid these emissions and to better consider the impacts of material choices on human health and well-being, climate, and ecosystems. Firstly, building with less, a shift towards a circularity approach or towards a circular economy approach in the buildings and construction sector would allow us to reduce or even avoid the extraction and production of new raw materials. This means maximizing reuse and recycling with the help of strong policy frameworks, but it also means renovations of old buildings, which create 75% less emissions than new construction. Secondly, using regenerative material practices wherever possible. This means investing in the research and design of ethically produced bio-based building materials, but also using materials like timber, bamboo, and biomass that can cut 40% of 2050 emissions in some places. And thirdly, decarbonizing the production of conventional building materials. Embodied emissions from cement, iron, and steel are significant, but they can be reduced or eliminated by changing formulas and processes. And green procurement and policies could help incentivize industry to make these changes. These 3 opportunities show that the potential for transformative change in the building sector is within reach with the necessary technologies, policies, and capabilities afoot. Now, allow me to say a word about the role of international cooperation and how we can learn across countries to accelerate the transformation we need. Now, many countries and subnational actors are already adopting strategies to move towards sustainable buildings and construction. From Denmark to Nigeria, we have seen policymakers integrating embodied carbon emission controls and energy-efficient design requirements into their building codes. In India, we have seen the active development of an extended producer responsibility framework for the construction industry. In Germany, France, and the Netherlands, we have seen increasing use of low-carbon cement, recycled steel, and sustainably sourced timber, contributing to a regional decline in embodied carbon emissions. Similarly, we have seen innovative financing mechanisms and initiatives emerging in parts of the world. Australia's Clean Energy Finance Corporation collaborates with financial institutions to provide discounted loans for sustainable home improvements and to support lower interest rates, providing homeowners with affordable and accessible improvements and upgrades like solar PV and electric vehicle chargers. A growing number of banks are supporting net zero buildings by setting emissions reduction targets for their real estate portfolios and using sustainability-linked loans to foster borrower engagement. Pooled financing and microcredit schemes will also be critical in addressing the barriers that small borrowers in emerging and developing economies face in accessing funding. Now, global forums like this one can help us to highlight some of these best practices. In my humble view, participants in this Congress actually amount to a coalition of multi-stakeholder actors across the value chain, all of whom will be essential to extending these best practices and accelerated the transformation we need towards the Sustainable Development Agenda. Now, we at the UN Environment Programme support international cooperation and multi-level collaboration by hosting the Secretariat of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. This global platform has been bringing together, or is currently bringing together, over 200 partners, from governments to private sector actors to financial institutions to civil society, all committed to a common vision, namely one of a zero-emission, efficient, and resilient buildings and construction sector. As of 2024, this global alliance has supported the development of 32 climate action roadmaps for buildings and construction at the regional, national, and subnational levels. Facilitated by the Global Alliance, UNEP launched the Buildings Breakthrough Initiative at COP28 in Dubai, which aims to make near-zero emissions and resilient buildings the new normal by 2030. We're also proud to serve as the Secretariat of the Intergovernmental Council for Buildings and Climate, established through the Chaillot Declaration adopted in Paris last year, and now supported by over 46 countries, from France to Brazil to Kenya. And in parallel, we saw in 2023 the G20 adopting a voluntary action plan to double energy efficiency by 2030. So, in our humble view, momentum is growing. We have all come together today, recognizing that this transformation of the buildings and construction sector is not only necessary to slow the triple planetary crisis that I've spoke about at the beginning of my presentation, but also how this transformation could be foundational to our collective well-being and the advancement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Ultimately, the transformation of the sector can make a real impact in the well-being of people around the world, from your families to your communities, to your friends. Everyone can benefit from this transformation. So thank you again to CIB and to Don for hosting us. We're grateful for the opportunity to engage with all of you today. Let us work together to build spaces that restore ecosystems, protect health, create jobs, and leave no one behind. Thank you very much.
So there is a good bit of time for questions, and whilst you're thinking about any such questions, and please do raise your hand if you'd like to make a contribution. Perhaps I'd kick off. I was struck when you were talking about best practices there towards the end of your speech, and I wondered whether you think research knowledge and expertise is well enough connected with policymakers around the globe, including the UN, to be influential enough. I mean, what advice could you give to people here, who, particularly perhaps some of our younger generation, who really want to make a contribution to the SDG agenda and have knowledge or are working on research projects which do, directly aim at some of those goals?
Thank you, Don. So, listen, the reality is that multilateral processes are complicated, messy, and sometimes difficult to engage with. I'm seeing it currently in the negotiations that I mentioned a few minutes ago on plastics, where coalitions of scientists are coming to our meetings and are not always finding the most appropriate ways to try to influence policymakers, but I think there is a growing realization that nobody has the perfect solution to any of these challenges, that we need everybody around the table. Now, the reality is that ultimately decisions, when it comes to something like treaties, for example, they're taken by member states. But there's many new formulas or examples of processes that are more diverse. 2 years ago, we came up with a global framework to address chemicals management, which brings not only governments, but also industry and scientists. This is a very, very large roundtable, so to speak. So I think there is a realization that the old way of doing business is changing, and I think that is going to offer new opportunities to practitioners like you, to academia, to experts. We at UNEP sometimes we think that we provide a tent, a large tent, that we want to enlarge as much as possible and where we want to have as many voices as possible, particularly those of experts. Because ultimately, only by bringing the science, the hard science and the hard facts to the table, will we arrive at meaningful policy.
Thank you very much. Evidence-based policymaking. Yes, discuss. No, often preached, perhaps not quite so often practiced by governments anyway. I'd welcome a hand or two in the audience to ask a question. We do actually have a microphone to make themselves heard. Is that immediate past President Keith Hampson with his hand in the air?
I'm afraid it is, Ron. Raphael, look, great to have you here. And can I say, on behalf of the CIB, we'd like to see this continue in terms of the relationship building again. And we won't hold it against you that you're a younger organisation than the CIB. I think we can do great stuff together for the long haul. Look, great speech, great goals. In Australia, I lead the Sustainable Built Environment National Research Centre. We work across the country with state governments, and on one hand, we have policymakers setting net zero, circularity, reduced emissions targets, and we have terrific projects delivering outcomes that benefit those sorts of goals. On the other hand, we have the agencies that are delivering main roads, housing, and the building type organisations are being reticent about taking up the materials and the processes that are coming out of the research that would deliver those sorts of outcomes. So the policy arms on one hand and the delivery agencies on the other, at a government level, the major procurers of civil infrastructure, for example, not aligning in terms of their goals. Can you provide any guidelines on how we may get governments within both national and at state levels to actually help deliver those goals?
I mean, listen, I joined this business, quote unquote, of the UN because I truly believe that we need countries to cooperate with one another, because I truly believe that by bringing everybody inside the tent, we can address issues that go beyond the borders of one's neighborhood or one's province, region, country, you name it. But I do recognize that there are real limitations to that work at the global level. I was in a session a few minutes ago and I heard somebody saying that, well, what truly matters is what happens at the local level. And of course, that is indeed the case. Now, we know that some of that fragmentation that you're talking about is one that we also see in our processes. We often have, in our negotiations, we have ministries, one-line ministry, let's say environment, that is negotiated on an area such as plastics, which has implications for industry, which has implications for energy, which has implications for health, etc. And you know, we don't have a magic wand to promote coordination. Now, I think perhaps the most powerful element in our toolkit is to try to create enough of a drumbeat so that actually that tent that I was talking about internationally also reverberates in countries. And then, you know, all of a sudden you get prime ministers interested in a certain agenda that perhaps had not always been at the top of the agenda. We saw it, for example, we spent a lot of time trying to put the natural environment, biodiversity on the global agenda. Now, it took a long, long time, and it took amazing people like Attenborough, for example, to try to bring attention to it. And then all of a sudden we saw that it gained a lot of prominence, and actually many countries started to take action to address or to conserve, for example, 30% of their landmass and their oceans. Now, so there's no perfect solution to the problem that you're describing. I know that's where, you know, that's where it really hurts, right? When you don't see that type of coordination. But what we can offer from our side is to try to send the messages from outside your countries, to try to engage with as many interlocutors in your country and your countries as we can, to try to bring as many interlocutors, including from outside the sort of the most important line ministries, into the conversation so that it becomes as multi-sectoral as possible. But again, we know that the real challenge happens at the local level and not at the international level.
We go from the immediate past president to the current president, Mark Hastag.
Rafael, thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation. You know, thinking about SDGs and thinking about sustainability, you know, you mentioned circularity, immediately comes to mind. But the question is that, do you see that there is enough of a supply chain in place for achieving circularity? And how do you see that differences in your negotiations around the world? Is there a movement to you know, complete that loop, in other words, of achieving circularity, but there's enough supply chain as well for that?
So I think you know the answer to your question. The supply chain is not there. And I think that is a reality. That's an economic reality. That is an industrial reality. The question is, how do we create that supply chain? How do we ensure that the resource agenda does not overwhelm us? I mean, we live in a world in which we know there are not enough resources. We're not going to be able to extract enough resources to meet the demands of a growing population, of growing urbanization. We see it now with the rush towards critical minerals. So the answer cannot just be extract. we can try, but we will hit a wall. And we've hit wall. We continue keeping walls. And of course, the market adjusts and the markets find solutions going left, right, center. But ultimately, when we preach circularity, this is not a religion. This is basically one of the tools in a toolkit to address resource scarcity. Now, we've seen a number of countries actually even arguing, well, is circularity, is that an agreed term? In fact, in our fourth Environment Assembly in 2019, there was a lot of debate as to whether to agree with, to reach a definition of circular economy. And countries actually walked away from that because they saw it as perhaps a Western-centric concept. So they moved towards the concept of circularity as an approach on resource efficiency. Now, I think we've seen since, certainly in our processes since 2019, a growing realization in many markets, and not just in advanced economies, that circularity as an approach makes a lot of sense. It almost no matter what your agenda is. But getting to your point about how do we operationalize it, how do we build those value chains, I think it takes learning from the areas where it is beginning to work, learning from what are the incentives that have worked. Look at extended producer responsibility. You know, it's hard to say that it has worked perfectly well all around the world, but in some places, I think laudable attempts are actually beginning to make a little bit of a difference in terms of creating that complex virtuous circle of circularity. So I think we don't have the perfect answer, but we also look at working with you and learning from you and all of your members and researchers about what are those nuggets where it has worked and what can we bring elsewhere. Hence my point to the earlier question about international cooperation is about learning from one another, and that's what I just saw in your halls. That was in some of the discussions certainly this afternoon. I saw exactly that type of learning across countries, what has worked here, what hasn't worked there. But I'm sure we can advance towards the answer together. I'm not sure there's a perfect answer just yet.
Thank you very much. I find it very interesting that, for example, also that the terminology of net zero has now evolved into talking more helpfully about near zero, and indeed we reflected that in the change of name of our own task group. Now I've got two final questions, so I'll go first to Zara, who is the co-coordinator of, I always get the numbers wrong, TG97, Nature-Based Solutions.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm from National Research Council Canada as well. So we are kind of at government level. We do come up with the policy developments, but when we do not get the industry involved from the get-go, they usually do not come to go with these strategies, whether it is the nature-based solution or anything. So we have to go with some incentive program like carbon reduction, carbon credit or tax reduction. But you mentioned that it should be involved at the local level. So we are coming with some ideas like knowledge mobilization and awareness program. So I was wondering what is the UNEP is doing in terms of getting involved more people at the community level, or do you have such program to go with the SDGs that you want to conduct them? So how you go with capacity building and knowledge mobilization?
So we are, as far as UN agencies go, we're one of the small to medium-sized agencies, so to speak. You have the ultra-large ones like UNICEF, the World Food Program, the UN Development Program, and we're somewhere in between. We're a small, tiny army of around 2,800 on a good day, spread around the world, working on a whole host of issues. Now, we do quite a lot of projects in countries, but it's mostly in terms of supporting them with their legislative process, with their regulatory frameworks. We do some capacity building, but mostly for local officials, for central and let's say regional, provincial officials. We don't always go to the local level. But the short answer is that it's not just us. It's a whole community, it's a whole ecosystem that are working to build local capacities. Now, is it enough? Absolutely not, and you know that better than I do. But I think it's, in some places, we've seen that ecosystem deliver what I think are meaningful progress in terms of nature-based solutions. And I think if somebody would have probably asked most people in this room 10 years ago if you knew what nature-based solutions were, I'm not sure everybody would have known. So I think, you know, the fungi is spreading very nicely, and we're hoping that as much as possible, that will also, not as much as possible, it will have to spread at the local level for it to really, truly make a difference. But thank you.
Thank you, Zara. Thank you, Raphael. And Michael Beam, you have the privilege of the final question.
Thank you so much. Great presentation. And so I was just wondering about, you know, just the relationship between the UN and the folks in this room, CIB. Could you just talk briefly about, you know, as 2030 approaches, and perhaps if the UN Sustainable Goals will get revised, renewed, and then specifically, you know, what advice do you have for CIB, for its over 40 working commissions, for the folks in this room, kind of this global community? What advice do you have for us to try to impact and be involved more in what you do as things go forward?
So perhaps on your first part of the question, if I understood it correctly, in terms of the future of the SDGs, so to speak, the answer is that it's unclear at this stage. I mean, the SDGs came out of a complex multilateral process that lasted several years and came out of the previous Millennium Development Goals, if you remember, which were very simple. There were 4 of them, and then we went to 17. So we don't know if the accordion is going to move inwards or outwards, but we assume that member states will find the wisdom to take another look at this apple, or another bite at this apple. We know that the majority of the indicators within the 17 goals are lagging behind. There's very, very few that are on track to be met by 2030. So the glass is, unfortunately, probably not half full if one is just taking a quantitative measure. And so we're hopeful that member states, as I say, will establish a process to devise new goals or a new framework in a manner that is inclusive, where everyone's voices are heard, including, very, very importantly, the voices of science. One of the interesting things that I've seen over the last few years under the leadership of the current Secretary General of the UN has been giving much more of a role to science. He's created a science advisory board that is his own in-house kitchen, or in-house council, so to speak. So they are advising him on complex issues, from deep sea mining, which you may have read about in the news, to the health of the stratosphere, to you name it. It goes well beyond the environment. And that was unheard of. There had not been that type of outreach to the science community and academia in the past. Now, in terms of UNEP and CIB, I wouldn't pretend to know everything that CIB has already been doing with the Global ABC Alliance. And Don, you're probably in a better spot to answer. But what I would say is that the more you bring to us actionable solutions that are replicable, that we know have worked in specific substances, and that can work across, let's say, levels of income. So it's not just, you know, you live in wealthy Australia, so to speak, and, well, it's something that has to ideally work in different environments. And so the more you bring us those practical solutions, I think the stronger you're going to make those multilateral processes, and the greater the chances that we're going to be able to broaden that tent that I was talking about. So tell us what works. I mean, I think that would be my message. But maybe, Don, you can complement on that.
Well, I wouldn't dare to emulate the keynote speaker, but we did have a nice conversation over lunch, and Raphael suggested a couple of other ways in which we will open channels, and you kindly committed to be our lead contact, as it were, in the UN to build on the foundations of the relationship that we've established in the last year. So thank you for that. We're going to sort of end the plenary at this level now, but Raphael isn't sort of running away, I don't think. So you're welcome to try to buttonhole him at least for a few minutes of private conversation. What I would say, exercising the platform prerogative as a final question, is I know one of your sessions this evening is to talk to the Purdue students, particularly about how it is to work with the UN if people are really motivated around employment opportunities with the UN. I wondered if you give us a sneak preview of the sort of message you'd be giving to young people in that respect.
Well, I mean, listen, I joined the UN because I wanted to serve. I didn't want to be in the military. I didn't want to become a priest, but I wanted to serve people. And despite the fact that working in a bureaucracy can blow your mind away, and not in the best possible of ways, I have to say that I couldn't have landed in a better organization. I've been privileged to work in different parts of the UN, and I have rarely met a group of people that are as motivated and committed to making a difference for people, and now in my current organization, also for planet. So there's a lot of avenues to get in. It's not easy, but if you want to hear more about those, join me tonight, and I'll elaborate. But I would certainly encourage anyone who has an interest in making a difference for the people around the world to give it a thought. We're not as bad as and as intimidating as sometimes we are portrayed. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Rafael Peralta.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Sorry, we have a gift.
No. On behalf of CIB and Purdue University, we have a gift for you coming here. We really enjoyed your presentation and the great work you're doing there with the UN. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Ryan.
you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Okay, that wraps up the afternoon sessions. It's dinner time. Make your way over to the Ford Dining Hall. Follow the crowd. Did you have something you want to say? And then the one thing that they wanted me to remind you is you need to be at the dining hall before 6 p.m. For dinner. So it gives you about, what, 45 minutes or so? So thank you very much. Oh, Mark, you get something?
I don't know, is this before 6? Let me see if we can find Sam.
We'll confirm that just in a second. I just wanted to point out to everybody that we have fantastic posters that are all lined up in the union on the other side. Please take a look at it. We have coffee placed on either end, and so you can grab a cup of coffee, talk to the students, look at the posters, and on the far end of that we have exhibitors. And so please make your way from either end, grab a cup of coffee, and go through the information that you can have over there. So enjoy your evening, and we'll see you again later today and tomorrow. Thank you.
Okay, Fred, we have an answer for you. It is up till 6:30. The 6:30. Ford Dining Hall, about 15 minutes that way, okay? Check your map. As I mentioned this morning, check out Neil Armstrong on your way. He's very close to the Ford Dining Hall. All right. Thank you. Another quick reminder, tonight at 7 o'clock, we have our concert out on the terrace. So you know about dinner, concert, 7 o'clock on the terrace, right here at the Purdue Memorial Union. Thank you.